Effective tax
But
administration
they all
fosters
start
public
with
trust.
accountability. Fiscal transparency
TADAT
means you're
isn't
doing
just
it
a
right.
tax tool.
It empowers you
build
to
your own
understand and
dynamic
build your own
revenue
dynamic
model.
revenue model.
It
Here.
all starts here.
Hello, welcome to episode 2 of TADAT Talks. I'm your host, Modeste Mopa, and today I'm joined by Katherine Baer, Deputy Director in the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, for a timely conversation on domestic resource mobilization and the crucial role of tax administration. What exactly is tax administration, and why should it matter to policymakers, practitioners, and citizens alike? Is it simply about the organization and processes that are in place to collect taxes, or does it represent something deeper, a system of trust, service, and accountability? If registration, filing, audit, and enforcement are its building blocks, why do so many administrations still struggle to turn policy into revenue? Katherine Baer helps us confront these questions head-on. What happens when tax systems are outdated, staff capacity is stretched, and public trust is fragile? How do these challenges shape a country's ability to mobilize domestic resources, especially in low-income and fragile contexts? We also ask, what makes a tax administration truly effective? Is it just about collecting more revenue, or is success rooted in strong leadership, smart technology, and a culture of service? Can simplifying procedures and reducing compliance costs actually strengthen both fairness and efficiency? Katherine Baer's career has focused on strengthening fiscal policies and institutions in IMF member countries across Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Her role includes oversight of the IMF's tax work. In that capacity, she has long been a driving force behind TADAT, both as an architect and a champion of its impact. Her advocacy has helped shape how the global tax community uses this diagnostic tool to assess performance and guide reform. This episode is packed with practical reflections and forward-looking ideas for anyone working to strengthen tax systems. Let's dive in. Katherine, we're so pleased to welcome you to TADAT Talks.
It's my pleasure to be here, Modeste. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Katherine, to start with, what does tax administration mean, and what are its core functions?
That's a big question, Modeste. So let me try and break it down, at least as I understand it. So a tax administration administers the tax system. It has so much contact with the society and taxpayers, both in the domestic realm and internationally. It implements the tax rules and the tax laws in a country. And as a result of the contract between the state and its citizens, then it does set out to collect tax revenue, which is one of the core reasons for it to exist. But it's broader than just revenue collection. It does represent the capacity of the state to administer the tax system, to administer the tax rules, and to set up the public institutions to do so in an effective and credible way for the society in a country.
So this is an institution that on a daily basis is responsible of turning policies into actual revenue. So can you tell me why tax administration is so critical for domestic resource mobilization?
Well, it is the engine, right, for administering the tax system and interpreting the tax laws in such a way, applying the tax laws, I should say. Interpretation more to the judicial system, to the courts, but applying the tax rules in a way that is fair, transparent, and that translates the intended tax rules into reality. So it, in many ways, how the tax administration applies the tax rules becomes the tax policy for a country, right? Those are the policies.
We usually think about best design policies. Looks like it's not enough to have the best policies if you don't have an effective tax administration. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, no, I mean, that's a good question, Modeste, because first of all, the policies have to be appropriate for the country, and policymakers and governments choose the types of policies, tax policies that they want to design and implement. But it has to go hand in hand with a system of promoting compliance with those tax rules. And, you know, in the tax literature, we've come to understand that as a tax systems approach to reform, in which you have the policies and, you know, the rules and the regulations, you have a legal framework, and you also have the application of those policies, laws, and regulations. So it's how everything works together that determines the implications of the tax system for an economy, and also how taxpayers will respond to those rules. And there, the taxpayer's behavior has a lot to do with that. There's a vast literature on determinants of taxpayers' behavior. And a lot of that has to do not only with the rules themselves, but how they are applied and how the tax administration is able to motivate or not taxpayers to comply with the tax rules. That actually goes much beyond the tax administration, as we know in the Fiscal Affairs Department, and is also linked to how public funds are spent and how efficient, how effective, how transparent that public spending is. So it's more than a tax story. It's really the state acting in its core capacities of both administering the tax system, but also allocating resources, public resources in the economy.
So you're highlighting, Katherine, how important effective tax administration is to turn policies into actual revenue. So could you tell us, Katherine, what according to you distinguishes a high-performing tax administration from the one that struggles?
I think there's a great spectrum, a very broad spectrum of better performing administrations and weaker administrations. I think the starting point has to be, well, what is the administration responsible for? What is its remit? Is it just domestic taxes? Does it include customs? Does it include Social Security contributions? So how broad are its responsibilities? Some governments, I think, or some countries where we work don't give that so much attention, and all of a sudden the tax administration is doing a whole lot. So I think that's an important aspect. But certainly, like any other organization in the public or private sectors, having a clear strategy, clear objectives, and having a professional workforce that's well managed with strong and consistent leadership over time, with sufficient resources to do its work effectively, and with a degree of autonomy in the sense of being able to carry out its mandate in a professional and transparent way. I think these are some of the characteristics of well-performing tax administrations. Why? If we have those fundamentals, that allows a tax administration to focus on its core business, which is, registering taxpayers, making sure they file and pay on time, having the appropriate systems to support that, having, risk-based processes, including for audit selection, having effective enforcement and taxpayer appeals functions. But those are all shaped and affected by these broader organizational aspects that I mentioned earlier.
That's very interesting, Katherine. If I could sum it up, you mean an effective tax administration, a high-performing tax administration is the one that fosters voluntary compliance and at the same time has the tools to enforce compliance. So why is the idea of voluntary compliance so important for modern tax administration?
That's a really important question, Modeste. And because voluntary compliance or setting up systems, tax administration systems, that are not only aware of the importance of having taxpayers comply voluntarily with the laws, it shapes how the tax administration works and how its systems are designed. Voluntary compliance as an underpinning of tax administration is really important because tax administrations only have a certain amount of resources, and they have to be able to deploy them in the way that really encourages the vast number of taxpayers as much as possible to comply on a, let's say, quasi-voluntary way with their obligations. You know, no one likes to pay tax, so you have to sort of be, you have to have a good carrot, I think. This means that there are resources also left for the enforcement actions. And so both are very important, finding the balance between both, but setting up systems and processes that facilitate taxpayers complying with the laws, make it sometimes automatic, say pre-filled returns with all the taxpayers' basic data, and either confirm or, edit or, question the tax liability and easily pay. So that idea of voluntary compliance or quasi-voluntary compliance is something that many modern administrations have adopted. But I have to say it's not a very straightforward concept for many administrations. In many of the countries we work with that are still quite focused on the control aspect and less on how to motivate the voluntary compliance through, for example, effective taxpayer services or good communication or good taxpayer education programs, and recognizing how important the role is of those in tandem with or together with the enforcement function. You really need to have both.
So what would you say to tax officials in these countries which might object and say that voluntary compliance takes time?
Well, first of all, I think they're right. The voluntary compliance does take time. There's the idea of going for the right balance and also not being able to control and enforce the entire taxpayer universe. You simply can't do that. And if you set up the tax administration systems, processes, way of operating, not only day to day, but as an overall strategy, to only focus on the enforcement aspect, then we've seen that the tax administrations of the countries are really not going to be able to get the results they'd like, because we know from many studies that it's the voluntary part or the quasi-voluntary part that generates the largest proportion of tax revenues for governments. So one does need enforcement, and it needs to be effective. It can't just be control for the sake of control. It has to be effective, smart enforcement, informed by what works and what doesn't work, and then paired with a focus on promoting voluntary or quasi-voluntary compliance for the vast number of taxpayers who we found in many countries, of those that are registered. The vast number of taxpayers really do want to comply with their obligations. They don't want to have trouble with the tax administration or the tax agency in their country.
So what you're saying, Katherine, is that we can strike the right balance between effective revenue collection and maintaining a fair and business-friendly environment.
I think one can, but that's different across countries, right? Given the context, the history of the tax administration's relationship with the tax-paying community, what's happening in the economy. But yeah, I would agree with your statement, Modeste.
So, Katherine, despite all existing opportunities, you mentioned voluntary compliance, you mentioned tools that exist to enforce compliance. Many countries still struggle to translate policy into revenue, especially in low-income developing countries. Let me share figures with you. I have here like 71 of them below the minimum target of 15% tax to GDP ratio set in the Compromiso de Sevilla. So in your view, what are the main obstacles, challenges holding back tax administration in developing economies?
The way to think about that is it's a multifaceted issue. There's not just one aspect. One aspect has to do with the design of the tax system, and that turns out to be really important because if it's overly complex, there are so many taxes with so many tax rates, and those rules are being constantly changed by government, and the regulations are not clear or are also constantly changing. This makes the task of the tax administration very difficult. And in many countries, we do see that there are very frequent changes to tax laws. They're not clear. The tax procedures codes are not well elaborated. And we help countries try and prepare, look at their tax laws and their tax procedures, codes, and regulations to encourage them to be well designed so that they can administer them, have a greater chance of administering them. And of course, the role of the tax administration is key, is having it well-resourced, a professional administration. Many governments struggle with having a professional administration because it's like that throughout the public sector. It's not only low salaries, but non-transparent recruitment, promotion, policies, training may not be there for tax officials, and then constant changes in the leadership of the administration. Non-professional, I would say, management of the administration makes it much harder to administer the tax rules effectively and have a strategy and a modus operandi of the tax administration that is robust. So I think those are some of the aspects we see that hinder the effectiveness of administration. Of course, the structure of the economy has a lot to do with it. Mm-hmm. Low-income countries are, by definition, low per capita income, so there's less to draw from the point of view of revenue in some countries. Maybe the economic activity is focused in the agricultural sector, and we know that that's a difficult sector to administer. Not impossible, but administratively difficult to administer. Many small taxpayers distributed throughout the country that don't necessarily have accounting capacities. They're not necessarily connected or used to doing business digitally. So these are just some of the things that we see that are hindering low-income countries. Some of the low-income countries find it even more difficult if there's conflict, if there's natural disasters. These really make it tough for not so strong administration to have to respond to that kind of situation.
That's very interesting, Katherine. And you mentioned something, maybe I would like to insist a little bit on it, leadership. According to you, Katherine, what are the main features, characteristics of a good leader in tax administration?
That's a good question, Modeste. You've been a leader yourself in a tax administration, so I'm sure you have lots of ideas about that. I think somebody who's really dedicated to making the organization function well, and whose job, person who sees themselves as a job of administering the tax system in the best way possible, in the most transparent way, who has a lot of integrity, and who works well with other organizations in the public sector, including, for example, the legislative branch, to explain the reasons why we want to work, the tax administration does what it does. And also a leader is somebody able to have a clear vision of what they want the tax administration to be like, so that they can bring their staff along and make the job of the line managers in the administration more clear, more transparent to staff. These are some of the characteristics of a leader. We've seen good leaders who come up from within the administration and know the administration very well. We've seen good leaders that come from outside the administration, including from the private sector, who are able to take the reins of the administration and really do those things I was talking about, draw up a clear strategy, agree on a clear strategy with staff, promote and motivate the staff to do a good job, that are proud of being able to report accountability, that are accountable, that promote transparency in the way the tax administration works.
These are really powerful insights about leadership, Katherine, and I'm sure tax officials listening to us are going to grasp a lot from these insights. So, Katherine, you've talked about this difficult and challenging tax administration environment. How can a tool like TADAT help countries identifying and addressing weaknesses in their tax administration?
Thanks for that question, Modeste. I like to think of TADAT as a framework for the leadership and the staff of the tax administration to get a sense of where their administration is in relation to good practices, maybe not best practices, but good international practices in the various aspects of the administration. And just a remark that I think the reason TADAT is so helpful is that it provides an idea not only of the relative weaknesses, but also of the relative strengths. And that's important to give a tax administration idea. Hey, you're doing this correctly. You're doing a good job here. Keep in the right direction, right? Whereas other aspects is like, no, you're going, you need to improve in this or that aspect. I think that TADAT is very valuable in providing that kind of framework, which is standardized across countries. And it's an outcomes-based assessment. It's not, how many sort of widgets do you have, how many staff do you have, or how many computers do you have. It's more focused on what is a tax administration able to produce as a result of all of its resources. Does it update its taxpayer register regularly? Is it accurate, that information? What is the rate of on-time filing in the country or on-time payment? Because these crucial indicators are what determine compliance levels and then revenue collected as a result of that. So TADAT is really kind of a revolutionary tool from the point of view of tax administration, particularly in emerging market and developing countries, because it provides that standardized framework. And it's something else that's very, I think, interesting and valuable about applying the TADAT is that different organizations collaborate to do that in each of the countries. So it's not only, it is an IMF sponsored kind of tool, but it is a public international good from the point of view of being applied by teams that come from many organizations that are setting out to support tax administration reforms in countries. And I should add that the TADAT has not only been applied, it's been applied across all levels of development, in advanced administrations, emerging market, low-income countries, fragile states. So proof of the pudding of its value is that it can be applied across many contexts.
Mm-hmm. So the tool has now been used for more than 10 years, Katherine, and with many countries that have undergone repeat assessment. Are you seeing progress over time with those repeat assessments?
That's a really good question, Modeste, and of course it's based on what we see, on the evidence we've seen. And of course the repeat assessments, one has to be careful with drawing conclusions because the largest number of the repeat assessments have been carried out in the low-income countries, which is where a lot of the TADATs have been carried out and where IMF and other partners support tax administration reforms. But it is very encouraging to see that of all of the countries that have had repeat assessments, that is one assessment and then 3 or 4 or maybe 5 years later, another assessment using the same tool, that it's the low-income countries that have made the largest strides in improving their scores. That means across the board, for example, in improving the accuracy of their taxpayer registers, in improving their on-time filing rate, improving their audit selection processes, et cetera. So in relative terms, we have seen that the most notable improvements in terms of TADAT outcomes and scores come from the low-income countries.
So, Katherine, it's really, as you stated, it encouraging to realize that countries are making progress in between assessment. But what is the impact of this progress, Katherine? Do you have evidence that strengthening tax administration can improve compliance and revenue?
Well, we're starting to have evidence. Is one answer, and many colleagues are now using the TADAT data to try and link it with other indicators to investigate just that question or ask that question that you posed. Let me talk a little bit about one paper or one research project that two colleagues in the Fiscal Affairs Department and I have been undertaking for the past couple of years. It's a working paper, an IMF working paper, in which we investigate, based on data, to what extent TADAT improvements in tax administration effectiveness as measured by TADAT. And there are other elements as well, for example, governance, the rule of law, the resources of the tax administration. But we look at several elements. To what extent do these relate to VAT gaps, VAT compliance gaps? And by that I mean the VAT revenue collected compared to the potential that could be collected if all taxpayers complied with their obligations. So we call that the tax gap, the difference between the actual revenue collected and the potential. We do tackle that question from 2 points of view. We offer a theoretical framework based on Allingham and Sanmo, a theoretical framework for looking at tax evasion and tax compliance. Based on that model and on that theoretical framework, we do an econometric analysis, and we find that that variable relating to TADAT, that means the across-the-board effectiveness of tax administration, organization, and functions, is strongly related to VAT compliance. In other words, the higher the TADAT score, the lower the level of non-compliance, or the smaller the VAT gap, defined as I just explained. We find that more or less, as an example, if a tax administration is able to increase its overall score from a D plus to a C plus, of course, this is all based on very careful calibrations of scores,
absolutely,
across the aspects of TADAT. If a tax administration is able to increase its score from a relatively D plus to a C plus, the VAT compliance gap falls, and additional revenue of about 0.6% of GDP in VAT can be generated. So the link, of course, is it's not tax administration's direct effect on revenue that we're trying to assess. It's the tax administration's effect on the compliance level, which then translates into revenue. And
that's fascinating.
Those are part of our findings. We have other insights as well, but we were very encouraged by those preliminary findings in our research.
That's both fascinating and encouraging, Katherine. So my question to you, based on these results, is what would you then advise policymakers just starting to reform their tax administration?
One of the most important things is to understand where you are by having this kind of assessment or diagnostic, we call it, because that's how you define what you're going to do and what your strategy is going to be for reform or for modernization. So carrying out a diagnostic that's robust and well understood by the whole organization, and that there's not only understanding but acceptance of that assessment, that diagnostic by the administration. I think that's a really important step. And it's not an easy one, because people like what they do, and they're used to doing things their way for many, many years, and to come along and say, well, maybe what you're doing is not having the impact it could have, that in itself creates resistance, which is natural in an organization. So having a diagnostic that is credible and legitimate in the eyes of the organization, and then on that basis, identifying which aspects are then fall into the relative weakness category, and what is the administration, what is the government going to do about that? Are these aspects already part of a strategy? Does that mean that they may have more emphasis and more resources? Are they not in the mix of the strategy at all, and then they need to be incorporated? And then are there resources to implement such a strategy? And also, how can external organizations, including development partners for the developing countries, how can we all support that process? So I would say, have a diagnostic, make sure everybody is on board with that diagnostic, formulate a strategy, get some resources, and if you have development partners, then bring them into that process in a transparent way. Who is going to do what? How can you best use those resources?
So these diagnostics can be, if I hear you well, eye-opener to many tax administrations. And I'm happy to hear that, because tools like TADAT are part of a collaborative effort to strengthen tax administration across the world. So my question to you, knowing that these collaborative efforts are very important to better serve the tax community, my question is, can you say a word, Katherine, about the importance of international cooperation in building strong tax administrations?
Sure, I'd be happy to do so, Modeste. I think just a basic observation is that this collaboration and this support is very important. It's what brings knowledge, know-how, in part, to administrations. Of course, another aspect is how they learn from their peers in the region, peers in other regions, and that's an interesting and an important part of improving the administration over the medium term. But I would say it's very important, and those administrations that I think have had strong support and with a clear strategy and good leadership. In other words, the collaboration part is not enough in itself. It has to be part of a broader strategy, and there has to be strong leadership on the receiving end. I think when you have that partnership, when you have that, those elements, then you really can see results. Most importantly, because the country wants to see them, and they determine the reforms, they're committed to the reforms, they know where they want to go. And when you have a country where the tax administration and the government has an idea of where it wants to go, how quickly, and that makes the role of collaboration, international collaboration, I think more effective. I think it makes development partner assistance more effective. And you can see more results, right?
Katherine, you have been a key player in this international environment. So to wrap up our conversation and looking back on your work advising countries on tax matters, is there a particular moment or experience that stands out as particularly rewarding for you personally?
You had told me you were going to ask me this question, Modeste, so I was thinking about this a little bit, and I think there are two different ways I would answer that question. The first is, yes, there's definitely been memorable experiences, and they have to do with what the IMF does. The IMF helps countries recover from macroeconomic crises and really deal with very difficult moments, economic moments in their history. And being part of that in several countries, but personally, Bolivia comes to mind in the debt crisis of the 1980s. Argentina comes to mind in its economic crises in 2001, 2002. Being part of the process to work with the officials in those countries to overcome some pretty dire economic and also fiscal circumstances, looking for concrete ways in which they could improve the design and administration of their tax system has been a really rewarding personally to work on. That's sort of one category of experiences. The other one, I have to say, is accompanying the countries that transitioned from the former Soviet Union to independent states, to sovereign states, and working very closely with a number of those countries to help design a more modern tax system, and those elements, introduce those elements of tax administration that we were talking about before. How do you promote voluntary compliance? How can you best harness technology to make it easier for taxpayers to comply with their liabilities? How do you explain the new tax laws of a market economy versus a centrally planned economy? And I have to say that was a very fascinating experience that I will never forget.
Thank you for sharing those memories with us, Katherine. And this concludes today's episode of TADAT Talks. A big thank you to Katherine Baer for sharing her deep expertise and powerful insights on how smarter tax systems can drive real change. From boosting revenue to building public trust through fair and efficient administration, today's conversation reminded us that tax isn't just technical, it is transformational. Whether you are shaping policy, working in public finance, or simply curious about how governments fund essential services, we hope this episode sparked new ideas. Stay tuned for more conversations that unpacks the tools, thinking, and people reshaping public finance around the world. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep asking bold questions and seeking better answers.